All right, welcome back. It's 7 o'clock tonight, and which is Monday, June 2nd. And I was planning on doing a talk with whoever showed up to explain the paper, but no one showed up. So instead, I'm going to do a lecture on balance, visual weight, and symmetries, like the title. So basically on balance. And so we're talking about balance as a design principle. And this is the other design concept that we're talking about in Unit 5. I already covered the first half of the design concepts of Unit 5, where I talked about the basics of color. But here we're going to talk about balance. And balance comes up especially in Unit 5 with the Renaissance, because we have a lot of examples of symmetries and near symmetries and balances based off of symmetry. And so I wanted to talk about that. Okay, so I guess before we begin, I do want to cover the fact that like balance is a big and complex kind of term in art. We, in this lecture, we're mostly going to be talking about the specifics of visual weight balance, like what we mean when we say like a picture feels left to right balanced to itself, that like the left-hand side and the amount of things on it feel kind of in equal balance to the right-hand side. So kind of a visual weight balance. But balance can be much more universal and much more subtle than that. I mean, when we talk about balanced artwork, we're also just kind of talking about the way an artist will balance contrast of value with contrast of color, with contrast of texture, or how they will balance contrast with unity, right? And that's less about a kind of a scale type balance, a left and right kind of balance, and more just a general the balance of the whole work. But we do, in order to understand visual weight balance, we need to understand visual weight. So we have seen a lot of examples of balance and symmetry, especially in the Renaissance, and sometimes plays off of symmetry, right? Like this is almost symmetrical, but then a slight shift off, or these kind of, right? Very close to a symmetrical balance, but not quite. But there's also a sense of balance. Like notice how this figure, he's taller and with the bigger hat, he kind of goes up. But then she, although she's a little bit shorter, she has this long dress coming down, so that extends downward, and that kind of flips the the shape of the balance. Or this is also a kind of an asymmetrical balance. But then we also have examples of much more strictly symmetrical balances, like here from the Van Eyck brothers, or this kind of symmetry, which is not a perfect symmetrical balance, but it's pretty close, well, except for in the center where things get much less symmetrical. And like we've seen a lot of kind of examples where there's artwork that plays off of symmetry. When you first look at this, you may not think of this as being a work of art related to symmetry, but you can imagine, think about the pose of quiet kind of calm that these figures would have had the moment before they were attacked, right? It's like they were kind of in a roughly symmetrical pose, and then all heck breaks loose. They're attacked by this demon snake, and all of a sudden he goes from being kind of a vertical element to a very striking diagonal element. Or similarly, there is this sense within Robert Motherwell's Elegy of the Spanish Republic, or this particular one, of it being like that there is some almost symmetrical balance there, except everything's been shifted over, right? Like that, if this was cropped slightly differently, and maybe just had less. And notice this is a balance decision, right? So he allows this third bar to just peek out the corner right there, which shifts it to being slightly unbalanced and less symmetrical. But then he counterbalances that by adding these thin sliver shapes on this side that don't exist anywhere on that side. So, so those are kind of asymmetrical balances that are based off of symmetry. Whereas here we have an asymmetrical balance that is completely not related to symmetry, except if you think of this symmetry, like when we think of axial symmetry, we tend to almost always think of the axis being straight vertical down the middle of a work of art, but it doesn't have to be. And if we imagine the axis being a diagonal, right, that runs through here, wouldn't go straight to that corner. It would go a little bit higher than that. But a diagonal like that, then all of a sudden, this work is much closer to being symmetrical. Still not perfectly symmetrical, but it's much closer to being symmetrical because it could be flipped on that diagonal one corner to the other, and there would be a lot that would be similar. But to understand these kinds of symmetries, we also need to understand visual weight. So let's talk about what is visual weight, what creates visual weight. So visual weight is not to be confused with emphasis or focus, right? Um, because when we talk about weight in literature, we're often referring to just basically how much importance and how much attention we're putting on something, right? But when we're talking about it in visual artwork, we mean something much more literal, like that literally the shapes feel heavy. They can also create emphasis, right? So like the word weight here is way heavier than the other text, right? Because it's darker, because it's thicker, right? It's just heavier. And especially against the word creates, because creates is on a diagonal because it's italic, so it's much lighter. So this is much heavier, but it also draws more attention and draws more emphasis. That can happen a lot. But notice this also draws a little bit more attention than the what or the visual because it's different. It's italics, but it's actually lighter visually. So these characteristics tend to create more visual weight. Things that are heavier or larger, like larger shapes, tend to read heavier. Darker shapes tend to read heavier. Less saturated colors, right, tend to read heavier than more saturated, as long as they're not super light colors, right? Rounded shapes tend to be heavier. More stretched shapes tend to be lighter, especially if they're stretched more vertically or stretched more diagonally. More pointed shapes tend to be lighter, especially if they're pointed, diagonally, especially pointed upward diagonally. Orientation, more horizontal shapes tend to be heavier, whereas diagonal shapes tend to be lighter and vertical shapes tend to be lighter. Complexity, complex shapes tend to be lighter. And position. But all of these are tends to be. And that's an important thing to remember because for any of these rules, we could find exceptions. So here are some plays on visual weight using just the letter R, right? So scale, like these two letters are the exact same letter, just difference in size, but the bottom right-hand corner R looks heavier, feels heavier. Um, but also kind of shape can this R because it's more diagonal and because it's made out of marks that are more active feels lighter. Whereas this shape, even though they're roughly about the same size, it's still a little bit more mass. But this shape, because it's squatter, because it's more blocky and it's more static, doesn't have as much movement, it feels heavier, right? Value. This shape feels lighter because it's white on gray, whereas this one is black on gray. They are exactly the same in scale. Complexity. This shape here is actually larger as an R than that R, but it is much more complex, so it feels a little bit lighter, which is interesting. And this gets back to what I was saying that like oftentimes attention and hierarchy and emphasis will be similar to weight, right? The weighted things will draw more attention, but not always. This is visually heavier, and this is visually lighter, but this draws way more of our attention. Okay. And we can see that same kind of idea just in the way these shapes float to each other, right? The the upward and more yellowish rectangle just feels lighter. So we also need to understand different types of symmetries. If you remember, when I was talking about this painting, I brought up the issue that, well, why does the axis have to be straight down the middle vertical? What if it was a diagonal, right? And that probably confused some of you because you'd never thought of any kind of symmetry other than a perfect vertical symmetry. But there are lots of different kinds of symmetries. So there's axial symmetry, right, like this, where something is flipped on an axis, right? That R is flipped over. But you could also have an axial symmetry where it's on a diagonal. The R is flipped on a diagonal going in that direction. You can have rotational symmetries and radial symmetries. I don't have any images of those here. But the other thing, axial symmetries can be on a diagonal, right? Like I showed over there. And also, they do not, axial symmetries as well as rotational symmetries don't have to be reflective, right? This is a perfect vertical symmetrical image, but it's non-reflective symmetry, right? Reflective symmetry is where it's a mirror image flipped from one side to the other. But this is keeping the same orientation. So it's symmetrical in the sense that we have on this axis, we have an R on one side. It's a particular visual weight. And then we have another R on the other side that is the exact same R, exact same visual weight on the other side of that axis. But both R's are pointing in the same direction. So it's non-reflective. Okay, so here's a little drawing I did to kind of get at the same sort of idea, right? This is reflective and axial symmetry, whereas here we have axial symmetry that's non-reflective. Here is axial reflective symmetry where it is asymmetric, it's like not centered. So it is off from, so we don't see all of this revealed over there. And here it's off-centered and also on a diagonal. And then here we're getting to rotational symmetries. So let's go back for a second and talk about the definitions of rotational symmetry and radial symmetry. Okay, so rotational symmetry is the idea that, well, let's start with axial symmetry. The definition of axial symmetry is a symmetry where something is the same in relation, like on either side of an axis of some imaginary line that you draw, saying it's all everything that we have on this side of the axis, we also have on that side of the axis. Okay. And if it's reflective, it's like exactly mirrored on the two sides of the axis. Okay. That's axial symmetry. Rotational symmetry is instead of thinking of a center axis, think of a center point, and then everything is repeated, balanced all around that center point. Now, there are some kinds of rotational symmetry, a special kind of rotational symmetry that's called radial symmetry, and that's where it is rotationally symmetrical and it's also axial symmetrical on at least two axes. So to give you an example, okay, so this is a type of rotational symmetry that is um, not radial symmetrical because no matter where we drew the axes, it would never be a perfect flip. Whereas the orange is pretty close to being radial symmetrical. Like if you drew a line here and here, it's pretty much a flip from side to side. Or even better, let's go to here with some artwork. Okay. So with the Andy Goldsworthy piece, it is rotationally symmetrical in that it is symmetrical centered around that center hole, but it is not in any real way radially symmetrical. But the rose window from Notre Dame Cathedral is radially symmetrical because not only is it symmetrical going around the center, right, repeating things around and around, it is also symmetrical on an axis. So on the vertical axis, horizontal axis, and even on the 45-degree diagonal axis, it's perfectly axially symmetrical as well as being rotationally symmetrical. So a lot of rotational symmetries that are not radially symmetrical are based off of spirals because spirals, by their definition, are repeating things around a center point, but also by their definition will not lead to things that are axially symmetrical. Okay, so the tiger is axially symmetrical. This is rotationally symmetrical. This is rotational and it's almost radial symmetrical. And this is even closer to being perfectly radially symmetrical, but not until we get to the rose window do we have actual perfect radial symmetry. Here we have something pretty close to a perfect axial symmetry, but there are differences, right? There's some asymmetrical effects, like we have a group of people here where they're all bunched up together, all kind of in a line, whereas on this side, everyone's more scattered, both back in space and just around. And we have some other things like everything is kind of like feels pretty symmetrical leading up to, from side to side, but then the two figures in the center, Jesus and St. Peter, are not symmetrical to each other because St. Peter is on his knee bowing to Jesus. Okay, I think that might be it. That is it. So what do you need to know from this lecture? Well, you need to know the definition of axial symmetry, rotational symmetry, and radial symmetry. Um, you need to know what we talked about in terms of visual weight. And yeah, you need to be kind of just thinking about where we see symmetries and other kinds of balances and asymmetrical balances, so that then when you're able to talk about artwork, you can discuss that, because that will come up with some of the artworks on later tests. And that's about it. All right, I'm going to end it there. Don't think I had anyone join me at any point on this. All right, thank you very much.